So without further ado, let's get into the discussion, as there's been much anticipation building with frequent references to the imminent launch of the free trade area. So I would first like to start with Peter, specifically because we've talked and we've seen a lot of preparation around the free trade area in a global environment that has significantly changed due to the result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so with a reflection on that, I would like to hear some views from Peter about how COVID has potentially affected global trade dynamics and what will be key in terms of the horizon post-COVID going forward.
Thank you very, very much. When we discuss COVID, let us bear in mind that what happened in March this year has never happened before, that the entire world simultaneously shut down their economies for reasons that were not economic. And this will have significant repercussions, both in the medium term and in the long term. When we talk about post-COVID, let us begin by defining what do we mean by it. As I see it, that is a situation where the pandemic is considered reasonably under control. We have a vaccine that is reliable and has a reasonable global outreach so that people can start to feel safe when traveling, touristing, attending conferences, and so forth. We are not there yet, and my assessment is that it will take at least 1 to 3 years before we enter a situation that can be considered as post-COVID. And some of the trends we are seeing now, I think, will be with us in terms of dynamic trade flows, even in a post-COVID situations. Others are changing. Let me then be a little bit more specific what I see happening. What we see in the current moment is a situation that will be very challenging for the entire global economy, but especially for Africa. I think we'll see in the coming years less global economic growth because there's a lot of overhang. And remember that COVID is not like war. In a war, you have a lot of destruction of physical capital that needs to be rebuilt. This is not the case here. Furthermore, COVID, unlike previous crises, especially hits service sectors like transport, traveling, tourism, attending conferences, attending business sessions, areas where some African countries have developed comparative advantage. We will see lower growth. We will see a more fractured global arena, and that irrespective of who will win the presidential elections in the United States, because the tensions between especially United States and China are real, and they will be with us no matter what. This fractured globalization also means we will also see more regionalization in terms of trade flows. Transnational companies will look around the world and probably not spread out production to the same extent that they have done. This is a challenge for countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, who have been able to tap into this. I also believe that remittances will be lower, which of course affects a number of African countries since it's an important source of foreign rate of exchange. I also think that in the short term, investments will be lower. Now, so what we'll see is lower growth, more regionalized globalization, less remittances, probably also in the short term, less foreign direct investments. When companies around the world will look at how they will reallocate, many might want to reduce their exposure to China. This will, I believe, increase the competitions of countries close to China, like Vietnam, Philippines, Bangladesh, which means that those African countries that have a lot of trade with that part of the world, I think, could benefit. In a post-COVID environment, we will see more of increased in service sectors, tourism, traveling. That, of course, will be beneficial to Africa, since a lot of African countries depend on that. But all in all, I would like to say that whether we look at the medium short term or the post-COVID, I think the external environment will be less benign for Africa than it has been in the last decade. And in such a situation, I think it is important to establish institutions that can improve the internal dynamics. And it is in this context that I see the free trade area as very important. I hope that gives some answers to your question.
It does. You've definitely given us some food for thought, and it's already sparking a debate in the chat. I'm particularly interested in your characterization that the global post-COVID, so beyond, let's say, late 2021, is likely to be less benign environment for Africa. Is that in a scenario which includes a potential African at the helm of the WTO?
Well, the WTO might have an African director general if things go well. But can you please repeat that question? I'm not sure I understood it.
I was just wondering, your baseline outlook is that it will be a less benign environment for Africa, if I've understood correctly?
Yes.
Post-COVID. And I was wondering if that baseline would actually, is there an upside if Dr. Ngozi Iweala is elected to be the next Director General of the WTO, given that position, the influence that she may be able to bear in championing Africa in the global trade order?
Well, I will not go enter into a debate whether Amina Mohammed or Ngozi Iweala is the best candidate, since there will be differences of opinion among the audiences. But I think yes, because it will, first of all, both are highly qualified, I should say, in the field. So both would be, in my mind, excellent candidates. I also think that it could, of course, increase the focus on Africa to a greater extent that maybe a non-African would not do, but not for any malicious reasons, but simply because that's the way things work. So I think that would be beneficial, and I think the chances are good that that will be the case.
So very much a positive indicator for Africa's position.
Yes.
And Stephen, if I could kind of slightly tweak that question for you on the same topic, how does the ECA and those who have been championing and preparing the ground for the Continental Free Trade Agreement see the prospect of having an African at the helm of the WTO? How do you seek to leverage that access?
No, thank you very much. I think I have seen what is in the international press. It's clear that Dr. Ngozi is one of the two finalists who are going now to go into that last round. And I think Dr. Ngozi has a full understanding of the African economy. She has been a minister for finance, and you cannot also talk about trade without talking about finance. She's also very well versed with the social issues like the continent is facing now, being in Gavi. So for me, I think having Dr. Ngozi at the helm of the WTO is actually going to have a positive or rather an upside for the continent, in the sense that one of the things that the continent fights against is what we call the tariff escalation. The minute you add value to something from Africa, then you are hit with these higher tariffs. So even if you have the AfCFTA, and I'll come back to this issue, the AfCFTA is going to help us foster regional value chains, which is something that has actually been exposed by COVID-19. So even if you add value, because you have emerging regional value chains, at the global level, the minute you try to sell the excess production that cannot be bought all within the continent, the minute you try to sell it outside the continent, then you have these tariff escalations, especially in the area of non-agriculture market access issues. And so having somebody who understands these particular issues at the helm of the WTO and using all the leverage that she can would actually be a great thing. So for me, I think it's going to be a positive to have Dr. Ngozi at the head of the WTO. And she understands also the AfCFTA very well. So that's going to be a positive thing.
Thank you, gentlemen. I suppose we should pivot back to the AfCFTA. And Stephen, I'd like to hear your views on how the global picture that Peter has kindly laid out for us, how do you view that impacting the progress and the rollout of the AfCFTA? We've seen that the launch date has already been delayed, understandably, given the public health and economic crises globally. But where are we now, and how is this period, this unprecedented period, shaped the way forward?
Yes, I agree with Peter on the issue about this, what is going to happen to the global, to the global value chains. I think, at least for Africa, one thing that we have been able to learn from this is that the pandemic started in China. And there was a lot of, there's of course a lot of trade that happens between Africa and China. But China is not the leading trading partner for Africa. The leading trading partner for Africa is Europe. So the pandemic impacts moved from China to Europe, where more than 30% of Africa's trade happens. Now, when it came now to Africa trying to get its supplies or even to be able to send its exports, it was hit hard because of what was happening in Europe. So this, of course, has policy lessons that one needs to deepen the regional value chains within the continent. And I believe the African Continental Free Trade Area is actually addressing this particular issue. You can be able to trade within the East African community between Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania, or Nigeria and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. But the minute you try to trade between ECOWAS and the East African community or SADC, you have a lot of difficulties because you have high tariff rates between the different regional economic communities. The AfCFTA will, with the stroke of a pen, bring this down, even before we talk about the non-tariff barriers, because the non-tariff barriers also exist within the regional economic communities. So the post-pandemic world, or at least this pandemic world, has exposed Africa to the challenges of not deepening intra-African trade. So that's one point I would want to with Peter. Now, the second one is on the services. Most of the African economies have a huge component of services. Now, the only problem is that you find that the value of the services within Africa, or rather the type of services that Africa has, are not those high-end kind of services like R&D, things that where you really leverage on your intellectual property rights. Now, the AfCFTA is also going to address this. Now, we are all talking about the vaccine, and we know that relates to a lot of research. Now, the AfCFTA is going to make it easier to have a competitive environment, because there's going to be a competition policy that is continental, but also we are going to have a lot of entrepreneurship driven by the protection of intellectual property rights within the continent. All these are issues that the AfCFTA is focusing on. Again, the pandemic has exposed to the continent that we need to be at the cutting edge of these issues, especially if you want to optimize on our capability in the services sector. And as a way of introduction, I would also want to talk about investments. The AfCFTA is going to create a level playing field when it comes to investment and investment landscape. As it is now, you have bilateral investment treaties between African countries, and you also, of course, have bilateral investment treaties between some African countries and the rest of the world. Now, through an investment protocol, the AfCFTA is going to deal with all these bilateral investment treaties within the continent, and it's also going to harmonize the rules when it comes to bilateral investment treaties between African countries and the rest of the world. And this is going to be very important in terms of being able to attract FDI, to have private sector coming from Sweden, for instance, locating in an African country, and being able to supply to the rest of the continent. So for me, the pandemic has exposed why we need to do things, but the AfCFTA is a very deep and broad agreement that is not just focusing on trade in goods and trade in services, but it is looking at those issues that will make this regional integration functional through competition policy, intellectual property rights, investment protocol, and also e-commerce.
Thank you, Stephen. You've kind of segued neatly into my next question, because you've referenced protocols in phase 2 and 3. And so with the delay in the timeline that we saw for reasonable factors, what is the next outlook? What is the outlook now in terms of the timeline to launch date? Mm-hmm. And what are the critical prepping steps that need to be? Yeah,
first of all, the pandemic has shown that Africa was right to start working on the AfCFTA. Why do I say so? Those of you who have followed the issue of COVID-related supplies would be aware that Africa has come up with a platform called the African Medical Supplies Platform, AMSP.Africa. You can find it. You can find it there now. The AMSP, you have suppliers from the rest of the world and suppliers from Africa, but it acts also as an aggregator of what different African countries need, be it things to do with PPEs or even to do with the medicines that have proven effective in terms of the treatment of COVID-19. So the fact that Africa is taking advantage of digitalization to deal with a pandemic like this, first of all, shows why it's important for the phase 2 of the AfCFTA to be concluded very quickly so that we can have a level playing field across the continent in terms of competition. But it also demonstrates that we do not have to wait for phase 3 to deal with the e-commerce. We should, as a continent, think of bringing forward the desire to have an e-commerce protocol under the AfCFTA. Now that I've talked about the issue of the AMSP, this medical supplies platform, let me say that there is a desire that African manufacturers, those who could repurpose their factories, to be part and parcel of the suppliers to the AMSP. So the AMSP has actually been able to demonstrate to the African countries and African private sector that it is possible for them to compete with the rest of the world. We have the finance question, and Afrexim Bank has actually come on board to help the African manufacturers in scaling up for them to be able to supply whatever it is that is being demanded under the AMSP. So for me, I think the outlook looks bright under the AfCFTA. The COVID-19 has allowed us to prove the concept in terms of what Africa can supply, and also to leapfrog to demonstrate that even digital trade can actually happen, and we can quickly be able to scale up and repurpose our manufacturing to deliver on what is being demanded across the continent.
So in your view, what is the likelihood that phase 2 and 3 might be completed before the formal launch?
Well, the start of trading is going to be 1st of January 2021. What needs to be concluded, and I think this is important for the audience, the countries have to finalize on their tariff offers to each other. This is progressing. There are some outstanding issues when it comes to the rules of origin, because of course we want to ensure that the AfCFTA is not abused in such a way that countries become transshipment routes for goods that are produced from the rest of the world and do not meet the rules of origin criteria. This is going to be concluded before 1st of January 2021, and so the trading can start. For the phase 2, the negotiations are going to start after the launch of trading, but the urgency for these other additional protocols to be concluded very quickly is already there, and a lot of preparatory work is actually ongoing, be it capacity building but also remembering that some of these issues have also been handled in our regional economic communities. So we are not starting from scratch to talk about competition policy at the continental level, because you do have that existing within COMESA. And we also have intellectual property rights issues also being dealt with two institutions. It's called OWAPI and DARIPO. So it's a matter of now seeing how do we quickly finalize on this.
So just briefly to clarify, with work still to be done in finalizing the tariff liberalization schedule and the rules of origin, how likely is that this will be completed by December 31st?
Okay, it's a
2020.
Question. Actually, quite a number of countries are ready with their tariff offers. But what happens is that because the rules of origin are supposed to make sure that a country benefits in terms of value addition taking place within the country, quite a number of them are waiting to see what kinds of rules of origin are going to be finally agreed, be it in the area of automobile sector, be it in the area of the textile sector. And once that is done, then they will be able to know what is it that they are going to put under the 3% exclusion list, what is it that they are going to put under the 7% of sensitive list, and what are they going to put under the 90% and up almost. The question is, how quickly is this likely to be finished? I believe by the 5th of December, when we are going to have an African Union summit focusing specifically on the AfCFTA, there is no reason to make me believe that this will not have been accomplished by that date at the beginning of December.
Thank you. And you mentioned the importance of facilitating mechanisms. So the work really starts from January 1st and ensuring that you're building sufficient momentum for a successful launch and sustainable course. What mechanisms do you have in place? What are the critical tools that you're providing to ensure compliance, especially around these areas which have, it's bleeding into early December. So we can see that they're quite contentious, if not heated, discussions around that. What mechanisms are in place to ensure compliance?
No, first of all, we have to remember that we already have the AfCFTA Secretariat. We have our Secretary General in office, His Excellency Nene Wamkele. He's already in office. He's putting together his team. They are going to focus on the implementation of the agreement as we have it now. Then, of course, those of you who may not be familiar on how these processes go, the negotiations will continue under the African Union, led by the Department of Trade and Industry. So the AfCFTA Secretariat is actually going to have sufficient time just to focus on the implementation of the agreement, and even as the negotiations continue. However, for the member states, they need to have national AfCFTA strategies that will allow them know where they should prioritize. In fact, as Economic Commission for Africa, we've been working very closely with the member states so that they can come up with the AfCFTA strategies that will allow them be able to know where they can optimize on the benefits. Of course, there are annexes under the trade in goods that deal with the issues of non-tariff barriers, which have been a major issue within the continent. So there is a monitoring mechanism which the African Union, of course, working closely with the international institutions like ANCTAD and ourselves, have come up with, which will be used to ensure that the private sector, as it moves goods from one place to another, they can be able to say, here there is a violation on this particular issue, which has already been agreed under the AfCFTA. So already that is being done. And then, of course, the private sector needs a lot of information for it to be able to trade, to know where the opportunities are. So there is something called the Africa Trade Observatory that is also being developed where the private sector can actually be able to see what are the tariff lines that are duty-free, what are the rules of origin that apply under each of those tariff lines. And all this is actually ongoing. And come 1st of January, all this should be ready. And I could talk more as we proceed on how we will monitor the benefits of whether the private sector is benefiting from the AfCFTA.
Thank you, Stephen. Speaking about private sector, I want to bring in Peter, since you have a great insight and extensive experience looking at the African economies. What industries do you see as being poised for a running start, let's say from January 1st, to really seize and maximize the opportunities provided by a free trade area?
When we discuss these type of agreements, they always take time, even when there are less countries involved, and even where all countries go in the same directions. I think that maybe can you clarify the last point of the question?
Just what sectors do you think will benefit first?
I think a couple of sectors. First of all, manufacturing at large. These are, if you look at the existing regional trade agreements that exist in Africa that Stephen talked about, you see that the trade pattern within those are often very different from the patterns between Africa and the rest of the world. So you see a lot of manufacturing taking place, especially in the East Africa. Manufacturing, I think, will be one sector. I also believe that increased cross-national in the digital areas, financial services, construction, and infrastructure. If you can have continent-wide, for example, financial funds to finance cross-national infrastructure products. But manufacturing, agriculture, financial services, digital services, construction, those are among the sectors that I think will benefit if we look in the immediate term after implementation.
And what do you think is most critical for them to be successful in the regional integration?
I think it's a very important question, because if you have such an ambitious agreement as that is, you need to try to see what can you start in order to get them maximum benefits in terms of welfare. I believe that on the whole, non-tariff trade barriers, logistics at ports, airports, to get goods quicker. The deficit in infrastructure that has been mentioned is also one very important part. Those parts, I think, are more important, for example, than tariffs. I'm not belittling that tariffs are important, but they are not, in my mind, the biggest obstacle. So cross-border logistics, infrastructure, and supply of energy, I would say, are among the most important.
And these are capital-intensive developments and projects. So bringing it back to a point that you made earlier on about a retrenchment of capital to safer havens, and that likely to be a trend for at least the next year. How are Africans going to address the infrastructural deficit?
Well, it's a very relevant point. First of all, I think we have to be realistic and say that public capital, whether we look in Africa or outside Africa, will not be sufficient to finance these projects. I would argue for trying to identify important public-private partnerships between African actors and outside of Africa. And I would also encourage to try to diversify, not rely too much on one country or one part of the world. I mean, it would be advisable to have a good spread between Europe, North America, and Asia. But public-private partnerships will have, I think, to provide the umbrella for such undertakings, the institutional umbrella.
Yes. Earlier, we heard from the CEO of Scatec Solar, which is leading the charge in solar PV expansion in Africa. What other Nordic industries do you think could be participating in such?
Yes,
PPPs?
I mean, these are areas where, first of all, a couple of Nordic companies are already there, and some are very successful, both in the North Africa that I know, also in the eastern part. And so, yes, that's definitely an area where I would see a lot of opportunities for Nordic companies in such a context. Other areas that I see are also digital infrastructure. I believe that one effect we'll see around the world as a result of COVID-19 is a big demand for the expansion of digital infrastructure across the board. And that's another area where I see that Nordic companies could have a lot of opportunities that could be beneficial both to the Nordic countries and to Africa.
Thank you. And thank you for highlighting, from your view, a key constraint. We did mention some technical barriers, as well as other non-tariff related barriers. So, Stephen, it would be good to hear your comment as to what initiatives are in place to mitigate those barriers, or if not, tackle them head on.
So first of all, let me agree with Peter on the issue of the manufacturing. So, of course, the Economic Commission for Africa has been working for many years in the lead up to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And many of you will see a lot of the published work that we have done in terms of trying to estimate the potential benefits of the AfCFTA. And one of the numbers that we like citing based on the simulations we do, looking at the modalities that have been agreed under the AfCFTA, is that 2/3 of the new gains in terms of intra-African trade are actually going to be in manufacturing. So I couldn't agree more with Peter that we are going to see a lot of gains in the manufacturing sector. So value addition, and of course we know that value added production tends to have much more sustainable jobs. Jobs are not as vulnerable as as jobs where you do not have value addition. I would also want to talk about the cross-border logistics in the sense that what COVID has shown is that unless you have a way of dealing with pandemics and emergencies, then you will have these lockdowns that are not good, first of all, for the people. They're also not very good for the economy. So one of the things that we hope we can learn, even as we think of the AfCFTA cross-border logistics, is that we need to integrate the indicators that relate to health when we think about trade facilitation. So obviously, transport and travel is going to be a major part of the services trade under the AfCFTA, but we have also seen that it is among the first one to be hit when you have a situation like this. So how can we ensure that going forward, we have trade corridors that do not lead to shutdowns, while at the same time protecting the population? And this is an area working quite heavily. So I don't know whether I got the question you wanted me to focus on at this point.
Partly, more so a response to, I think, Peter's comments. It was more oriented towards what mechanisms are in place to address technical barriers.
Yeah, I had actually started to work on this by talking about the non-tariff barrier mechanism and NTBs is basically part of an annex of the trade in goods protocol. And then, of course, the trade in goods protocol also has an annex that relates to trade facilitation. And it also has issues to do with the non-tariff measures, things to do with SPS and TBTs. So the question is, what is being done to operationalize the commitments that the member states are making, or rather the state parties are making under these annexes? And I gave the example of the non-tariff barrier mechanism. Then, of course, the AfCFTA Secretariat is going to have committees that will be looking at some of these specific issues. So the fact that the secretariat is in place, and now we are in the tail end of getting the directors that will be leading trade in goods and trade in services, then we are going to see the state parties establishing the necessary committees that will deal with things to do with SPS and TBTs, which are essential things to focus on, but also the ones that will also be dealing with how do you resolve the non-tariff barriers that are reported by the private sector. Now, allow me at this point to say that we have this initiative as the Economic Commission for Africa, where we are coming up with what we call the AfCFTA Country Business Index. And the AfCFTA Country Business Index is going to be a tool that will be used by the private sector to be able to see whether the AfCFTA is delivering for them. It will be able to show whether, be it in terms of services trade or goods trade or investments, whether it is delivering for them. And whatever it is that we read from that index, then we'll feed back to the AfCFTA Secretariat and also to the state parties, because these negotiations will continue, and review of negotiations of agreements will also continue. So already there's a lot of preparations for the start of trading, including addressing the NTBs, which, as Peter has said, are much more important even than the tariff reductions.
The details that add up, very much so. I am conscious of time, and you two are inciting a rich debate in the chat function. So I would like to bring the audience in and some of the questions that have come up in response to the points that you've made. Somewhat going back to the WTO, and regardless of who's chosen to be at the helm, does the AfCFTA create a momentum where there's more political will on the African continent to be more involved in the negotiations or discussions around the future and the reforms around the WTO? It's a question for either one of you.
I think Stephen is better placed to answer that one than I am.
No, thank you, Peter. So, there is always a question of sequencing. And so we are clear that the multilateral system, or at least the global trade regime, has not fully delivered for Africa. We know what is the agenda for the continent when it comes to the WTO issues. And I think the Doha round had actually captured what Africa wanted to see very, very clearly. But all of us know that the Doha round did not go very far. And one good response from the continent was actually the AfCFTA, because within the AfCFTA, you see Africa wanting to talk about investment issues, including investment facilitation. Africa wants to talk about e-commerce, and these are things that Africa does not really sit very actively on the table when it comes to the WTO or multilateral issues. We know most of the economy of the continent is driven by SMEs. More than 80%, most of the private sector in the continent is about SMEs. And so we know that Africa has not been talking a lot about the SMEs when it comes to the WTO. So in terms of sequencing, the AfCFTA basically will allow the continent to be able to come up with a good understanding of the rules, and even maybe set the standards of what should be happening at the WTO. So there is something that the African continent, through the AfCFTA, can actually be able to deliver to the rest of the world. And I'll conclude on this part by saying that the AfCFTA is also being framed in a way that is as inclusive as possible. So we know that the WTO at the multilateral level, we started talking about trade and gender, and it's a conversation that is going very well. But from the outset, the AfCFTA has put the issue of inclusivity as part and parcel of ensuring that no African country or no African citizen will feel like they are being left behind by the AfCFTA. And that's why it's quite deep, and that's why it's quite broad in terms of the issues that it is dealing with. We say it's being more than trade.
And to that point, there's a follow-up question as to, are there mechanisms in place to ensure countries that are perhaps maybe adversely affected or not gaining as much to level out the impact of the AfCFTA?
Well, there are rules that countries can liberalize their trade under different time frames, but I think this question is very good because it highlights a very important issue, namely that in order to capture the maximum gains from liberalization of trade, a lot of policy efforts will have to be made at the national level. There are a number of things that cannot be done at the free trade level. And here it comes to the flexibility of labor markets, the investment climate, because when you start to trade, some sectors will diminish, others will increase. And the important thing is to make sure that those that are displaced will be able to be allocated to other more dynamic sectors. And for that to happen, each and every individual country will have to ensure that its labor markets are flexible, that its policy towards entrepreneurship or that its policies are conducive to entrepreneurship, to open to foreign trade, protect property rights, and so forth. And and that, by the way, we talked about transport logistics and things that's also an area where a lot of national policies will have to be complementary to policies dealing with the free trade area.
Peter, just a follow-up question. Are there any notable African countries that are an example of already having that conducive regulatory framework in place?
The sound is not perfect. Can you please repeat that question?
Sorry, maybe on my side. Are there any countries that you can think of that would be great examples of having that regulatory framework in place?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Well, you referred to the importance of having flexible labor markets as well as a conducive labor investment climate. I'm just wondering if there are any specific
usually
country
when you
examples.
look at international benchmark studies done by the World Bank, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, etc., you see a set of African countries that usually rank very high: Mauritius, Botswana, Cape Verde, Rwanda, and so forth, and others as well. But these tend to be highest up, these countries. Yes, but I don't think size really matters here. You also have big economies that have improved a lot in such ratings. Kenya is an example, Ethiopia is another, the Ivory Coast is a third example. So I don't really think size isn't necessarily an answer here. You also have small African countries that are not high ranking. These are questions of what are the political and economic dynamics, how they play out in each country. Yes.
More coherent and stable policy.
I think it goes for Africa as for any part of the world, that countries that have institutions that are conducive to growth, investment, trade, tend to perform better than those that do not, regardless of which part of the world we're looking into.
We're nearly to the end. There was one point that Stephen made that I'd like to hear Peter's view on, and it was the importance of SMEs, not just in driving the launch of the free trade area, but also in the post-COVID recovery. If you had any comments or insights with regard to the outlook for African SMEs which are arguably bearing the brunt of the lockdowns and other disruptions.
Thank you very much, Natznet. We've done some 2 surveys. We did a survey that we published in April. We did another survey that we published in July. We did this with the international economic consultants that are based in Mauritius. And one of the things that we saw, so the survey was basically trying to see how the African private sector is coping. We looked at the private sector that is working in the area of goods. We looked at the private sector that is working in the area of services. And one of the things that came out clearly is that quite a number of them have actually tried to adapt by taking advantage of digitalization. Now, they also told us that they have tried to identify new suppliers for what they want. But the interesting thing is that many of them are really waiting for economy to reopen so that they can go back to their global suppliers who are not necessarily within the continent. Of course, that tells you that there is an opportunity there for these SMEs, because majority of them were SMEs, to at least be facilitated to build on the results that, or the new things that they have seen under COVID-19. Now, of course, the issue of finance was a big issue. Many of them had cash flow problems. So the fact that the AfCFTA is also going to open up the financial services sector, we believe this is going to be a positive thing for the SMEs. Of course, this financial sector in the continent can also benefit from the DFIs, like those from Norway, because we need as much capital as is needed for us to be able to scale up and take opportunities of the AfCFTA. Those are some of the things that emerged in our conversations with the SMEs.
Very insightful, thank you. I hope that we haven't completely lost Peter.
Yes, sure.
Oh, you're still on the line. Great. Just keen to hear your insight or perspective on the outlook for African
I agree with
SMEs.
what Stephen has said. There's one topic we haven't touched upon, which I think is very important with regards to SMEs, and that's the informal sector in Africa, which we know is very big, both when it comes to cross-border activities and within economies. It's also the fact that it's a sector that, as far as we know, employ a lot of, relatively speaking, a lot of women. That I think it's important because they provide jobs and incomes, but there are also limits to how sophisticated such informal sectors can be. And here I think the African Free Trade Continental area could be important in formalizing a lot of these informal sectors with providing capital for SMEs. I think this could also be conducive to reducing the gaps between men and women with regards to payment and employment opportunities. So that's, I think, a dimension that should be added.
Thank you, Peter. I see that we're up against the hour. This is very much a debate that can continue. Thank you, gentlemen, for the rich discussion. We've highlighted some very positive insights around the inclusive nature of the AfCFTA and how it can support those who are most adversely affected by the lockdowns and COVID-related disruptions. Stephen, thank you very much for the updates. I'm sure the audience, the chat function was very excited with the updates that you provided. So looking forward to January 1st, the launch of the free trade area, and
thank you
very much.
Moderate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.